in World War II. So we're going to be going over art made as a response to World War II, as well as what was happening in the art world at that time. So we're going to go over a few things. And just a few things to note, we will be live streaming this onto the NCCHE Facebook page. So if you don't want to have your picture in there, please feel free to turn off your camera. And it'll also be recorded and put onto the exhibit website. So again, if you're not comfortable with that, totally fine. Just make sure that you have your camera off. And we would also really appreciate it if you would turn your microphones off. Just for now, we can take questions at the end though. So have your microphones off while we're presenting, but at the end, if you have any questions, you can use the chat or you can unmute yourself. But I think that's about it. So Phoebe, if you want to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. Yeah, so today, as she said, we're going to be talking about the state of art in World War II. And so, of course, that means that there will be talks, just as like a little content warning, of Nazi ideology. We're not going to be, glorifying it, of course, but just to kind of give you some context for the way that the Nazi movement responded to art, we are going to have to talk about the ideology briefly. And then at the very end, there is a little bit of kind of explicit imagery. It's imagery that is going to be seen in the Knights Collection exhibition whenever it launches. But just as a content warning, there are going to be, I believe we just have one explicit image at the very end of some corpses that are piled up, just so you're aware that that's something that's coming if you're not comfortable with that. And so, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. We're going to be starting with talking about the response from the Nazi movement to art. So, art has a very powerful capability of swaying public opinion. And the Nazis at the time were aware of this. They were very aware of kind of the power that art holds in society, in politics, and propaganda, and all of that stuff. And so they decided to use art as a tool to tell the Nazis' narrative of who and what was or wasn't desirable or appropriate or right in society. And so to execute this, one thing that they did is they had two exhibitions. You can see I have the two posters here for the two shows that I'm going to be talking about. And these two shows were held just a few hundred yards away from each other in Munich, Germany. The flyer that I have here on the left side of the screen was the flyer for an exhibition called Great Exhibition of German Art. That's what that translates to. And then on the right, we have the flyer for an exhibition called Degenerate Art and Kunst. And at the bottom here, you have Kunst, which means art, in air quotes, or I guess quotation marks in this case, to already kind of set the tone for the fact that it's not really even art, or to kind of draw into question whether or not the art that they're going to exhibit really qualifies as art or has any validity. And so first, we'll start off talking about the Degenerate Art Exhibition. So this show was made up of works of art that were removed from state-owned museums across Germany. There were over 20,000 works of art that were removed from these museums. And in 1937, they put together 740 works into the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And essentially, the way that they kind of built up the show, kind of as I mentioned with the flyer, was to almost invite viewers to make a mockery of the art or to look down on the artwork that was in this exhibition. Even the things like the didactic labels you can see down here under some of the pictures, they have what would typically be educational materials under the pictures in museums or exhibitions. In this case, they used them to directly mock and disparage and degrade the art as well as the artists who had created it. And you can see over in this picture on the left, it was a very popular exhibition. Over the course of its run, it ran from July 19th to November 30th in 1937. There were over 2 million people in attendance at this show. And the thought process that they kind of claimed it was for was to educate the public on, quote, the art of decay, end quote. Essentially, they were kind of using this art as proof of genetic inferiority and society's moral decline. So this kind of style of art that they put into this museum, they were hoping could act as, again, big air quotes around this, proof of the inferiority of the people who had created it. However, not a lot of the work in the Degenerate Art Exhibition was actually made by Jewish people. So that obviously brings up the question, what makes degenerate art? I keep throwing around this term, but if you don't have, a strong art history background, you might be a little confused about how something was considered or how they qualified something to be degenerate art. And very broadly, degenerate art was categorized based on ideological grounds, whether it was the grounds of the artist or what the individual work of art was kind of espousing through the imagery or the iconography. Because there were actually, so I have, an example of what was considered degenerate art at the time. This was the very popular art style. This was kind of what was new and exciting in the art world. And so there were many, many high-ranking Nazi officials who actually used to collect work by the artists who would then later be labeled as degenerate artists. So it was basically just the ideological grounds that as the Nazi movement came into power, they decided, oh, we can no longer enjoy this art, and oh, we need to try to downplay these artists, and we need to try to, disparage them and kind of make them seem very negative in the public eye to push our Nazi narrative. And actually, I thought it was very interesting during my research, some of the art that was shown in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, some of the 740 pieces that I mentioned, actually came from the collections of these high-ranking Nazi officials. Hitler himself, you may be aware, he had been an artist in his youth. He got rejected from art school. But so he understood the power and the value that art had within society. And so he placed a lot of emphasis on trying to denigrate the art which had messages or ideologies that were against his narrative and his kind of desire that he was trying to push. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these two pieces and these two artists. So on the left over here, as you'll see, I have a self-portrait by Oskar Kokoshka. He was a Viennese artist, and as the Nazi movement was rising into power, he became a very vocal anti-fascist. So he was very public about the fact that he was not a fan of the Nazi movement. He did not believe in what they had going on. And so this kind of put a target on his back, both as an individual as well as a figure in the art world. And over the course of when all of these pieces of art were being removed from public display, Kokoshka himself had around 630 works removed from museums and galleries. And again, I mentioned he had this target on his back, and so he kind of went into exile into Switzerland to keep himself safe. So despite the fact that he had all of these works in museums and galleries, because of his personal ideologies, he was deemed a degenerate artist, and his work was degenerate art, and therefore it was put into that exhibition. And then over here on the right-hand side of the screen, I have a work of art by Max Beckmann. He was a German artist, and he was called un-German, despite the fact that he had volunteered as a medical orderly in the First World War, and was himself a German citizen. He was called un-German as a way to kind of devalue him and his work. He had, as I said, he was a medical orderly in World War I, and so he saw a lot of horrifying, awful things, and it deeply changed him and affected him as a person. And so he kind of captured that in this piece called The Night. You can see there's the figure right here who is, he's ill, he's in agony, he's in pain. Over here you have a woman being mistreated by these war figures, you know, these soldiers, generals, whatever. And so he clearly, through his art, was telling this kind of negative narrative of war and fighting. And so that kind of, put him into the degenerate art category. And in the actual degenerate art show, he had 10 works shown. So he was kind of a prominent figure in this show, which obviously would not have been ideal at the time. And because of this show, he left Germany, and he never returned again. After degenerate art opened, he was no longer safe. And so he left his home country, and he never went back even to visit. And so I think there's something kind of interesting between these two pieces of even something as simple as a self-portrait in the case of Oskar Kokoshka was counted as this degenerate art and something that was, undesirable to be shown to the public in any sort of positive light. It was something that they wanted to really kind of stamp down on, not because the actual content of the picture was in any way un-German, but simply because the artist himself had these anti-fascist ideologies. And then, of course, in Beckmann's work, you have very explicitly this sort of anti-war or kind of very negative but realistic view of what was happening in the First World War. And so now, I wasn't fully comfortable showing a lot of the actual art that was shown in the Great German Art Exhibition, because a lot of it is propaganda art. It is what the Nazis were showing to people to turn them into Nazis, or people who would be complacent with Nazism and the Holocaust. So I didn't want to give that too much of a platform, but I did want to contrast these two pieces. So on the left-hand side, I have a piece by Wilhelm Lembruck. This was shown in the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And then on the right side of the screen over here, I have a piece by Arno Brecker, the decathlon athlete. And so I kind of wanted to contrast the content of these two shows to give you more of an idea of the narratives that they were trying to push through them. So much of the artwork in the Degenerate Art Show was a little bit more expressionistic. It was a little bit more abstract. You didn't have quite the same level of realism that you would have seen in the art of the Nazi propaganda show. So over here on the left, as you can see, the woman's body is very unidealized. It's imperfect. It's not this beautiful, Greek Adonis or Greek goddess like you see in the decathlon athlete piece. And her body is also very elongated. Her neck is extremely long. Her legs are almost twice the length that you would see in real life. Because this is a very large statue. It was about life size, but exaggerated in these ways to make it less realistic. And this was considered very undesirable in the sort of Nazi art movement. And, perhaps you could say something here about the fact even that the degenerate art piece shows a woman and the Nazi art propaganda piece shows a man, and if there's something to do with sexism in there, not to say that there were no women depicted in the Great German Art Exhibition, but just kind of something to think about what the narrative that they were trying to push was with who was most desirable and best in society. And so focusing a little bit more on the German art show now, essentially the way that they tried to categorize like what would go into this Great German Art Show, they wanted things that would fit their Aryan ideals. However, within the art world, what would be considered Aryan ideals wasn't really firmly defined. Of course, the art had to fit Nazi ideals, but the way that they did that was a little bit unclear. The curator of the Great German Art Exhibition had, picked all of the works that he thought would be really great in the show. And then Hitler himself, before it opened, he came to kind of look through everything and basically have final say of what would be in the show. And Hitler was actually very, very angry with a lot of the work that was in the show because it didn't fit his specific kind of personal idea of what should be qualified and categorized as this perfect Aryan art. Very broadly in the show, all of the art is very traditional. It's all pretty firmly rooted in realism and idealism. So I'm sure, we've all seen people who are perfect decathlon athletes who look like Greek Adonises at the gym, but that is not your everyday person. That is very much an idealized form. And all of the figures in the German art exhibition were very strong and heroic looking. The woman in the Degenerate art show, she's on her knees, so she's in this more vulnerable position. Her face is downcast, so she's putting herself at the mercy of the viewer. But the figure in the German art show, he stands very tall, he's looking straight ahead, he's a very, very strong figure. And so even just from these two pieces, I think you can see pretty well, if you look kind of closely at the details, the different narratives that they were trying to push, and specifically what they were trying to say was desirable and ideal in their perfect Aryan world. And of course, all of that to say, the art in the Great German Art Exhibition served pretty explicitly as propaganda for the Nazi art movement. But of course, there's so much more to talk about when it comes to the way that the Nazis responded to art. I think, you have these 20,000 works of degenerate art that I mentioned that they pulled out of museums across Germany. And so they had to do something with all of these works. They only exhibited about 740 of them, and that was only for a brief window. So what did they then do with the art? Here I have pictured the Fischer Art Auction, also called the Grand Hotel Auction. This took place in 1939. Essentially, the German government found, it was around 5,000 or so pieces of degenerate art that they deemed internationally marketable, essentially work that they could sell outside of Germany. They needed to push their own narrative and propaganda about what art was within their own country, but they figured if they could get the art out of the country and make a pretty penny along the way, why wouldn't they? So at the Fischer Art Auction, there were 126 pieces of degenerate art that were sold in Switzerland. And all of the money that was made from the Fischer Art Auction went straight to the German government and eventually funded the war. That was about 500,000 Swiss francs, to give you an idea of just how much money they made from all of these pieces of art that then went into funding World War II. And there were also around 5,000 other works of art that were sold through art dealers across Europe. So the Fischer Art Auction was kind of a really big event, and there were even some very prominent museum curators and heads of very popular museums in the US and across the world who were there, and they bought this art from the Nazis because it was very good, very famous, very popular art at the time. Here you can see in the auctioneer's hands, that is a Vincent van Gogh piece. And of course, I think we're all familiar at least a little bit with who Van Gogh was and how big of a deal he is today. He was certainly a very big deal then as well. And then, of course, I would be so remiss if I did not mention the art burnings, which took place. This happened late 1939. There were around 5,000 works of art that were burned in Berlin. And so there are some works of degenerate art that, of course, have survived until today through whatever means. And there are some that are very tragically lost forever. And so those are pieces of art history that we no longer have because of the way that the Nazis responded to art. And in a way, it also develops art history and is, something that we are obviously talking about now. That just becomes kind of part of the history of the piece and these art movements. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to talk about, we've gotten up to 1939. There wasn't a whole lot of time for art during World War II itself, but what happened after World War II? How did art then respond?
Thank you, Phoebe. So obviously, as you could probably even just imagine, artists responded very strongly to World War II, and they used their art to communicate their feelings just like we saw with Phoebe's part of the presentation with artists who were soldiers that responded to World War I. So before we even get into World War II, I just want to expand a little bit on World War I response for art. So I want to talk about Kurt Schwitters and Max Ernst. So these were two soldiers in World War I, and you can see some of their responses here just visually. So we'll talk about Kurt Schwitters first. This is picture of spatial growths, picture of two small dogs. And this actually took place over a time span of about 19 years. So originally, Schwitters was a Dadaist, so we can see some Dada in this work. Obviously, this isn't a traditional painting, and this isn't a painting at all. It's actually made out of garbage and propaganda that he had found. So this is kind of like a collage piece of art. It was made after World War I, and you can see that Schwitters is really rejecting the rational. So again, this isn't a traditional piece of art. We're not really seeing anything that's really noticeable, something that we can even really make out. It's called Picture of Spatial Growths, picture with two small dogs, but we can see it's pretty abstract. It's very non-objective. We can't really see what's in this. So World War II really made, or sorry, World War I really made soldiers feel like there was no rational answer to anything because the war completely changed their worldview. So instead of having rationality, there's no rationality at all. So we're kind of seeing this in Kurt's work here. And he continued to add to this work again from 1920 until 1939, so for about 19 years. It's made of garbage, as I had mentioned, so it's kind of a collage piece. And he was pretty much adding to this until he was forced to flee from Nazi-occupied Germany. So we can see kind of where it ended at the end of, or sorry, the painting started at the end of World War I, and then it took place until pretty much the Nazi occupation. So we can actually kind of see how linear that timeline was and how it affected him, both World War I and World War II. Definitely seeing a rejection of the rational here because the rational just doesn't make sense anymore. It's just not rational. And that brings us over to Max Ernst, and he did Celebes in 1921. So Ernst was a German soldier, and he saw firsthand the trauma of war with the soldiers that he had worked with. So this painting is very surreal. You can see this kind of machine in the middle. Almost looks like an elephant or a tank. And you can even see a gas mask, which obviously was a pretty big part of World War I. And towards the front, you can see kind of a figure beckoning him. And it's kind of like, it almost looks like a sculpture from antiquity. So maybe this kind of represents art and culture in the time period. On top of the machine in the middle, there's this sculpture. And then up in the sky, if it even is the sky, there are fish. So it's super surreal, non-objective, not very realistic. So again, this kind of response to the war that nothing really makes sense. And he's using this non-objectivity to kind of work through his emotions as someone who has just exited the war. So this kind of like feeling of helplessness against the machine, which could also translate against helplessness against the war, against government. So we're kind of seeing here, visually, we're seeing how he felt. And he's kind of translating that into this painting. And this is a real focus on this dreamlike state, something that really doesn't make much sense because the war was so horrible that this dreamlike state, the stuff that didn't make sense, was almost an escape for people who were really struggling with this PTSD. And that brings us to non-objectivity in World War II. So kind of like along the same lines as before, they're using this non-objective to explore their personal response. And the artists I'm going to talk about are Mark Rothko and Barnett Neiman, and these were both color field artists. So color field artists would use these fields of color to try to bring themselves and viewers to a higher truth. And I think that it's so interesting to think about artists like Rothko and Newman, these color field artists, because these are the kind of artists that people will always see in museums, and they always say, I could do that. And you might be able to do this. You might be able to just paint these color blocks, but it's what's behind these paintings that's so riveting, and really everybody can really respond to it and kind of internalize it. So Rothko's works are a way of understanding the presence of a god or the divine. And Rothko was a Russian Jew, and he grew up in a time of increasing anti-Semitism. So you can imagine when World War II happens, this anti-Semitism, it's kind of almost like he's drowning in it, like he's kind of struggling with it, of course. So before the war, Rothko was actually creating a lot of realistic paintings, but after the war, he shifted into something that was a lot more philosophical and a lot more thought-provoking. So what he kind of intends with this is that the viewer would find a higher truth by kind of having an internalized conversation with the painting. And I'm a very big fan of John Hughes, so I always have to use him when I'm talking about things. And this kind of reminds me of that scene in Ferris Bueller's Day Off when Cameron is standing in front of Sunday Afternoon at the park, and the camera's going back and forth between him and the painting. You can see this realization in his eyes. That's kind of what you're supposed to do with things like this. You're supposed to have this internal conversation as you're looking at these brushstrokes, these big fields of color, and that's supposed to kind of get you to a higher truth. And you can imagine in a time where such atrocities were happening, it kind of feels like God had abandoned people. The divine wasn't even, around anymore. So using these paintings was a way to reconnect with God or with the divine, something of a higher power, something to believe in. And Barnett Neiman was kind of along the same lines. So he was an American painter, and he was the son of Polish Jewish immigrants. And the MoMA had a really good quote for him that I wanted to read. So they said, start quote, "For him, art was an act of self-creation and a declaration of political, intellectual, and individual freedom," end quote. So his works really exemplify being alive and being individual, which is something, of course, that everyone can relate to. And he's known for these zips in his paintings. So you can see these stripes going along the canvas. They were called zips. And this piece is called Ver Heroicus Sublimis, which is Latin for man, heroic, and sublime. So Newman wanted the viewer, again, to have a conversation with the painting. And by kind of understanding the painting, they start to understand themselves. So it's almost like meeting a new person. You're learning about them, and in turn, you're actually learning about yourself with this internalized conversation that you're having with it. So it's definitely, of course, this rejection to realism and objectivity, starting anew after a tragedy and searching for reason, rhyme or reason, anything that really would kind of have faith or instill faith in you after something like this would happen. And it's very interesting to look at Rothko and Newman because these were both Jewish artists. And you can see that their response to World War II and anti-Semitism was to create something so non-objective that they actually find themselves and find that higher truth after all of these atrocities in it. And a lot of the kind of backgrounds for the paintings that they had done was pretty much based in Jewish faith. So not only is it for the viewer to kind of understand themselves, it's also for Rothko and Newman to help understand themselves too, in a world that, again, just really doesn't make any sense. And another thing I think is interesting, just kind of contrasting, comparing with Phoebe's portion, is that this is obviously something that the Nazis would have hated. They would have hated this. This is not traditional painting. It's very, abstract, doesn't make any sense. So I also think that's something kind of to note. I think that's kind of important to think about. But we'll move it back to Phoebe. We're going to show you a few paintings and kind of compare them to some of the photographs that Harry Knights had taken.
Yeah, so I wanted to we thought it would be nice to tie together everything, not just kind of show you all of these images and then expect you to go look at these pictures from Harry Knights and to kind of, magically make all these connections or understand the relevance. We thought it would be nice to kind of talk through our thought process a little bit. So we also wanted to address art as a historical document. So previously, I had shown you this piece, The Night by Max Beckmann. Despite the fact that this is not a piece that is heavily realistic, it is not the same as a photograph like what we have from Harry Knights. It's still offers us kind of this direct experience that Beckmann had in the war. No, he didn't necessarily walk into a tent and see all of these things happening at once, you know, all of these different figures and all of this trauma in this one very condensed moment. But he would have seen and experienced all of these things over the course of his time in World War I. And so that kind of the art that he then created based on those experiences is as much a documentation as the photos that Harry Knights took. And in some ways, it kind of offers us a little bit more of like a personal peek into the way that he felt about it. It kind of gives you that like emotional resonance. And for these two images in particular, I wanted to kind of contrast the iconography a little bit, the visuals that we're seeing. There's a lot of kind of very, very similar parallels from the kind of side-turned, eyes closed, pained face that we see in this prisoner of war or political prisoner who was killed in the Holocaust, over to the face over here in Beckmann's piece. Both of these images really capture the horrors of war and the trauma that came along with it. Both the trauma for these two individuals, for Harry Knights and then for Beckmann, as well as the kind of broader trauma that the wars caused in the world, from the individuals whose lives were lost and were taken, as well as the trauma that was left behind in those who survived. And art acts as such a valuable historical document because, yes, you can see, you know, all of these things written about. You can read books and journals and all of these things, but having these actual visuals is so, so powerful and so striking. I remember the first time I got to flip through each and every image that Harry Knights had taken, that Jim Knights was kind enough to donate to the Holocaust Center. I felt so shaken to my core. Like I almost felt as if I could hear the sounds of, you know, soldiers walking around me and the clink of weapons and vehicles. Like it was such a visceral experience in so many ways. Like it became so much more than visual for me. And I know some people, of course, you can have that experience by reading things, but I think just being able to really tap in to what you can see can be so, so powerful. And it also, these pieces, they kind of tell the stories of those who were lost. Without adequate documentation, we might not have known about what happened in the Gardelogen massacre, which, of course, if you're not familiar with the collection, you may not be familiar with the history of the Gardelogen massacre. That's something that you'll see more in the exhibition when it launches on November 6th, as well as we'll have future talks about it. But without adequate documentation, we may have no idea that had happened. There could be other atrocities that people have suffered that we don't know about because we don't have documentation. And so these photographs are so valuable in so many ways, as are the works of art that we've talked about. So I think just wanted to touch on that. And then, of course, I would also like to contrast some stuff that Hannah talked about with some of Harry Knight's pictures. Here, as Hannah mentioned, with Rothko's work, we really see the way in which art is used to capture the hearts and minds of the people who created it in the moment that it was created. As she said, you maybe could paint a picture that looks just like what Rothko made his paintings look like, but it wouldn't have, I suspect, the same emotional resonance because you would not have had the same exact experiences that Rothko had. And so I thought it would be nice to kind of contrast, you know, we have this beautiful color field kind of split in half that Rothko was so well known for with Harry Knights's piece. He had written on the bottom of this photo, kind of on the margins, clouds on the sheltered side of the mountain. And so you kind of have this really beautiful, you know, line going down this picture as you see where the mountains just cut off the clouds. And I think this is such a breathtaking picture that I think most of us, you know, could never have taken. How many of us have stood on the peak of a mountain, or perhaps he was in a plane when he took this, and gotten to see such a clear cut through the clouds like that. I think it's so staggering. And you kind of have this sense of like romanticism with Harry's photograph, the kind of grandness and majesty of nature. And similarly to Rothko's piece, you kind of have this grandness that you're being invited into, where at first you might just think, oh, this is two colors on a canvas, or you might just think, oh, it's some clouds on the side of a mountain. But if you allow yourself, as Hannah said, to have a dialogue with the piece, to really engage with it and let yourself kind of be absorbed into it, you can kind of step into something really, really incredible. And these are only, two of, I think we have over 70 images in the exhibition, as well as, of course, there were many more that were donated that didn't end up getting included. So there's just so much more to dig into, and we're very excited for you to dig into it on November 6th, or of course, whenever you can visit the website. That kind of wraps up like the presentation portion. So I hope that you will enjoy the show whenever it gets launched. I hope that we have a bunch more talks coming up over the next couple of Fridays, and I hope that if you're interested, you would attend some of them to learn more about the exhibition and the way that we put it together, and the death marches, Gardelag, and as I mentioned, all of that. You register for these the same way that you registered for this one today, if you're not already. So please, we would love for you to come join us. Myself and Hannah are doing the curator docent tour, as well as the night's collection start to finish. But for death marches and Gardelogen, we have Dr. John Spurlock and two history students from Seton Hill, Hannah Johnson and Jared Kroll, who are going to be talking about all of the research that they did into just this whole thing. Without them, this exhibition would not be half of what it is. We're so grateful for all of their scholarship that they did for us. So I hope that you'll come join us for it. Here we have some links if you're interested in any more information. We're happy to share them with you later. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And I guess, Hannah, are we good to open it up for any questions people have?
Yeah, for sure. So if anybody wants to unmute to ask, you can also use the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with, but we'd be happy to answer anything you might have.
May I go?
Sure.
Thanks. First of all, thunderous applause. It's humbling and inspiring to work with such talented students. So you're amazing. I was struck when I saw the images unfold this evening, how the photos informed the art, but in some ways the art was almost prophetic, like the Max Beckmann painting of the night. When you juxtaposed it with the graphic photo, it's something that was abstracted, that looked, not art. Then we see how it became real in that sense. And then the Mark Rothko, which is so nebulous and so esoteric and metaphysical, to see that cloud and nature and the spirituality. So I just think how the visual documentation, the realism of photography, working with these other larger cultural constructs, you just did a masterful job. So no question, just I'm in awe, and you're wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Maureen.
Yeah, I just would like to echo that thunderous applause also. I just think this was awesome. And I'm one of those people, you talked about the abstract art with the color blotches. And I'm one of those people that, like, when I see something like that, I think, yeah, I could have done that too. But the way that you explained it really helped me understand what that type of art is all about. So I really appreciated that. The other thing I wanted to mention too was, as far as the Nazis and art go, that during the war, they stole tons of art from all over Europe and hid it away. And thanks to the monuments men, during World War II, a lot of that art was able to be recovered. Like, trying to think, Charlemagne's bust, what else? The Ghent altarpiece, things like that. So, you know, the Nazis did I don't know if you want to say they had a fine appreciation for art, but they knew how powerful it was, and they did want to keep a lot of it. So that's
yeah, even though they tried to censor it, they still knew how important it was and how impactful it was. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I completely agree. Despite the fact that I am now an art historian, 100% grew up being of the mind with modern art that like I could do that. And I think just the more that I learn and the more I dig into it, it's really staggering sometimes that if you just spend enough time with a piece, you'll kind of gain an understanding of how much can be said with so little. And it's really incredible. So I'm glad that we were able to, you know, kind of share a little bit of that with you today.
Hi, this is Jim stepping in. Just wanted to thank you and echo the other comments. It was really a great presentation. My dad would have appreciated it. And I learned a lot about art, German art. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim.
Anyone else have any questions?
I just wanted to say thank you too. One of the reasons I was even interested in is my father-in-law was from World War II, and it affected him so much that he really didn't even talk about it at all. I mean, you rarely heard any stories about it at all. And I don't know which concentration camp he went to, but his troop or whatever were one of the first to enter into one of the concentration camps. I don't know whether they called that emancipation or not, but I didn't hear that from him. I heard it from my husband. So when I saw, you know, what this collection was about, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in it, because that was something he experienced. And in a way, I'd be able to experience something similar, but also help me understand more who he was, because it so affected him, that his life, and that something he disturbed him so much that he could never even speak about it.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you.
Oh, of course.
For all the work you did. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing your story. I think it is so important to not forget about what happened. And I think that this collection is so important, and it will be important. It will continue to be important. And we're just so thankful that we were able to work with it. It's so interesting. We feel like, Phoebe and I talk about this all the time, we feel like we know Harry. We feel like we know him through these photographs and just through the little things that he wrote. So it's really nice to be able to connect to someone in that way.
Mm-hmm.
What I find so hard to believe is, like, even recently in news, I think there was a teacher who was trying to say that it didn't even happen. I mean, you hear this periodically, and there's all this documentation, you know, i.e. what you've done, and I don't know how you could possibly say that. So what you're doing is very important, because I mean, you do know people at this time who, maybe not a lot, who went through it and experienced it, but there's going to be a time when they're gone, but you have recorded it for history, and it'll be available for everyone to see, so that we try to prevent this from ever happening again.
Absolutely.
That's what you're doing is so important.
Thank you so much, Cindy.
Presentation.
What was that? Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much. Anyone else have any questions? Anything you would like to add?
Yeah, we like threw around some art jargon. Was there like anything that if you're not specifically an art person, that it would be helpful to have clarification on, or anything like that?
So Phoebe, this is Dr. Spurlock.
Mhm.
You only showed the one image from the Nazi approved art. Is that generally the case? Was it all this kind of glorified figural art? You know, all of this.
Mhm.
Was it? It seems to me there's, you know, they just took these artworks and translated them directly into their propaganda posters.
That was essentially the case. So I had the one image for the Degenerate art show of the inside of the exhibition, and there was a similar one for the German art show that I considered showing, but there were just so many works of art that, you know, just really glorified those Nazi ideals that, as I mentioned, I didn't want to give a platform to. But it was essentially the walls,
very appropriate.
yeah, the walls like lined with these, you know, heroic looking statues who had these idealized bodies, and it was very heavily, you know, paintings that were pretty realistic, that were figural, but all of the very specific type of person that were considered ideal under the Nazi regime. And as you said, it was essentially much of the work that was in this great German art show could have been directly used in the propaganda posters that I'm sure, you know, many of us are kind of familiar with. And it's kind of, you know, disturbing to look at them sometimes, seeing the way that these things were glorified. So again, I just don't want to give too much of a platform to it, but that the one piece that I did show kind of gives a very good idea for you of what the rest of the show was comprised of. Not all sculptures, but all very much in that same vein.
If I could follow up with a question based on some of the comments, you know, about like the abstract art, and, you know, it's a tough gig to sell in that sense. Perhaps would either or both of you want to comment on Rothko and Newman's use of the non-objective and connect that to their Jewish identity?
Yeah, so as I had mentioned, they were using their Jewish background and their faith to kind of inform the works that they were doing. So it was a way of kind of, again, finding this not really common ground, but an understanding of the world through how they had seen it before the war. So after the war, again, when it was kind of like this feeling of abandonment, how could God let something like this so horrible happen? They were using this like non-objective way to work through it, because again, like this rational like the rational was not rational anymore. It made no sense. How could something so horrible happen? So instead of using like, you know, things that they had seen before that were traditional works of art, and like how you know, Rothko had made traditional art before, art that like kind of made, you know, made sense to people. He moves into non-objectivity because that just doesn't inform him anymore. It doesn't help him anymore. So it's so important, I think, to know that and to know the background of what works like this, because I had not known how, like, I wasn't informed on the background of this until I took your class, Maureen. I had no clue that that's what they were doing and how important their identity was and how they were able to just translate that onto a canvas. It's really incredible.
Yeah, and I think the way that I view it is especially that kind of feeling of abandonment by God. They would no longer have been served by doing something more objective. They really had to turn to these color fields and to this non-objectivity, because, you know, something that we would see in like Christian or Protestant art of like Christ on a cross, that's such a classic image. But in this intense feeling of loss and abandonment, and kind of questioning, you know, God as a concept, you know, whether he even existed or anything like that. Those kind of very recognizable classic images from Judaism, just it wouldn't have served them. It wouldn't have kind of fulfilled that purpose. And so I think as much as they intended for us to look at the paintings and try to find divine truth in them, they themselves were using them as a tool to try and find this truth and to try to kind of work through their own like internal struggles with faith. And I don't personally think that that's a thing that they could have achieved or executed quite in the same way if they had used more recognizable things. I think the fact that they had to turn to these color fields really speaks to the depth of their emotions and their sense of loss.
Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This was a lot of fun. I don't mean to speak for Phoebe, but I'm sure you feel the same way.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Yeah, it's again kind of a dream come true, I think, for both of us to be able to share our knowledge with you and learn from you as well. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. And don't forget, the website launches November 6th. You'll be able to see the collection of photographs, and it's thenightscollection.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, again for attending. Hope that you all enjoyed.